So if I were to tell you that the London Underground was covered in webs, what's the first thing you'd think of? That's right, Yetis. Doctor Who Classic, and this review is brought to you by Patreon! My Patreon, specifically, because when I do classic reviews, which one I do does get voted on by my Patreon supporters. I'm getting that plug in there because literally every little bit helps. Like, seriously, even the lowest tier is very helpful. Okay, moving on. So this is a second Doctor adventure. It is the second appearance of the Great Intelligence villain. It is the first appearance of Brigadier Lethbridge-Stewart, although he's only a colonel when we see him here. It's the second Doctor, so it's Patrick Troughton. It's Jamie McCrimmon, who is, that they are some of my favorite Doctor companion pairings ever. It's got Victoria, who's there. And it's got some of the better location shooting because they did actually get to shoot in the London Underground. So, yeah, this one I hadn't seen before. And if you do watch it, be aware that the third episode is still missing. So what that one is for that episode, you get a series of still images, and the audio is still around, but you don't actually get video on that. You can follow what's going on in the nature of that episode. It's not too difficult to track, but just be aware of that. So plot-wise, actually, it's probably worth mentioning, if you haven't seen Enemy of the World yet, you may want to watch that one before watching this one, because this one picks up like immediately on a cliffhanger that story ended on. And when they sort of talk, coming out of that situation, some of the things they talk about also indicate how the villain was defeated in that previous story. So I haven't seen Enemy of the World yet, but I now know how the villain is defeated. So I guess that's just a heads up there. In any case, Jamie, Victoria, and of course the Doctor in the TARDIS find themselves suddenly stuck, wrapped up in webbing, and then forced to land the TARDIS in the London Underground. And then we get the appearance of the Yetis, which immediately indicates the Great Intelligence. Now, if you only know modern era Doctor Who, the Great Intelligence was, it showed up in the Snowmen, and then in the Bells of St. John, and then in the Name of the Doctor. And it is an intelligence without form. It does not have a body. It can take control and manipulate various things, including people, but it does not have a physical form. So there's a number of things at play here, and some of them are quite interesting. So we've got kind of the claustrophobic setting of the London Underground, which has been infected with, it looks like webbing, but they call it a fungus, which is growing and making more and more and more of the areas, humans can't safely travel there. You've got the Yetis wandering around. So you've got tense atmosphere, you have an encroaching threat, you have monsters. It has that base under siege vibe, that kind of claustrophobic vibe. And like I said, because they got to use the actual London Underground, it looks pretty good, especially for Doctor Who of the time. I was actually surprised how good the Yetis look. I've said before that black and white film really, it can be really forgiving of some otherwise very wonky effects. And the Yetis actually look surprisingly good, except for the one episode where it's actually above ground and we see them wandering around the streets in wide shots in broad daylight. Yeah, they don't look good then. But in the tighter shots, in the tunnels and the corridors of the London Underground, no, they look pretty good and they work pretty well. So you've got military forces down there trying to figure out how to beat all this stuff back and not having a lot of luck. At the time the Doctor and his companions land, they're trying to detonate stuff, collapse tunnels. Nothing is really working at all. Now, also mixed up in this is Professor Travers. Now, he is a recurring character because he was involved in the story The Abominable Snowman, which was the first story with the Great Intelligence and the Yeti. So when the Doctor and his companions show up, and they run into him, it takes him a minute like, oh God, you really do have a time machine because you haven't aged a day. But, they have an ally on the ground who's been involved with this kind of stuff with them before. The guy who plays him is interesting. He seems to dial it back as the episodes go on, but his very first episode, holy cow, that was some really amazing overacting that he does in that very first episode, because he would lock his head, he wouldn't move his head, but then he would do this incredibly exaggerated line reading and these lip movements, and the eyebrows would go mad, but the head was locked in place. It was very strange. Like I said, he seemed to dial it back in later episodes, so I wonder if the director told him to knock it off or something. So that was kind of interesting. He's also got his daughter on hand, who's a scientist. Anne was her name. I actually rather liked her because you actually get a soldier asking her, so, what are you doing in a place like this? And she just goes, when I was a little girl, I thought I might want to be a scientist. So I became one. That's the perfect answer. I like her. And you've also got an odd mix of characters. I mentioned the Brig. And I know, again, he's not a brigadier yet. I'm still going to call him that. You've got this sort of, on-the-ground sergeant type. There's a reporter who's kind of a Weasley, not particularly trustworthy guy. There's a guy who's normally not somebody who, he's in the army, but normally wouldn't hand him a gun and send him anywhere. He's a driver, primarily. Now, it's funny because another thing that it seems to be pulling some of its vibes from, and I don't know if the original novella was written before this came out, but it would be Who Goes There, which was the story that inspired The Thing from Another World, and then eventually The Thing. In that, one of the things about the Great Intelligence is because it can kind of overtake minds under certain circumstances, there is the fear that there is somebody in their midst who is in cahoots with the Great Intelligence. And so there's a little bit of that paranoia going on, and characters kind of a little bit, can I trust you? Can I trust you? And of course, this being the first time we meet the Brig, they don't trust him. And so there's that kind of thing going on. And it's interesting enough that it kind of works with what, for me, would have otherwise been a notable complaint, although it still did bug me as I watched it, which is that there are more characters that get devoted amounts of screen time than I would normally like to see. And I mean that kind of in a fairly specific way, because normally one of the things I like about Classic Who is the fact that these stories overall take longer to tell. We get to know the supporting cast more. The problem is here, a lot of the supporting cast don't seem to have a function other than to bulk out the cast numbers. Because, the reporter doesn't really do anything that drives the story. The coward doesn't really do anything that drives the story. There's a handful of other, kind of officers or what have you that are basically interchangeable and don't really do anything to move the story forward. But the reason that they're there, narratively and functionally, is to have a large enough pool to have the paranoia happen. Because if you have only got, basically only characters that we've known before and, two new people, well, it's got to be fairly easy to figure out who's working with the Great Intelligence here. So I get why they needed a bulked out cast. I just and I'm not even going to say that it doesn't work. It just, they are character archetypes and kind of non-functional in the narrative, other than the story benefits from there being more named characters than you would otherwise put in this particular story. It's probably a little long, too. It's 6 episodes. It definitely could have been 5. It probably could have even gotten away with 4. There's some very extended sequences of basically the Doctor and other people just tinkering with stuff that just kind of drag a little bit. And I mentioned the one above ground action scene. Yeah, that should not have been filmed. That was not pretty at all. Bless their hearts for trying. It's, but it doesn't look very good. But overall, I was quite happy with this. Obviously, Troughton is top of his game. He's absolutely phenomenal with this. And him and Jamie I will always love. Jamie's one of my favorite companions. And I mentioned Victoria. Victoria, she just was one of those companions who was there to mostly scream as needed and occasionally get captured, and that's basically all she does here. She's got decent enough performance chemistry with the other actors, so that it's not too bad, but she doesn't bring a lot to the table, and it's always going to be Jamie and the Doctor, or the second Doctor. That's always going to be the pair that I'm like, yeah! So, but seeing them together, the Yetis work pretty well. The idea of the intelligence actually is pretty well executed, and as much as I did sort of complain a little bit, I don't know about all these characters, the vibe of the paranoia combined with the more claustrophobic feel, combined with the monsters that, as long as they're not in daylight, actually look pretty good. It's a solid early Doctor Who era story, I gotta say, overall. So, The Web of Fear introduces a whole lot of cool stuff. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. A whole bunch of stuff to do because there's buttons, there's links, Patreon, merch, more. Click on them. They'll take you places, or don't. If you don't want to, you don't have to. Because at the end of the day, folks, you're the council. I'm just running the meetings. So until next time, this council is adjourned.